Can you tell us a little bit about your position at Pitt?
My job title is teaching associate professor. So I am a teaching focused faculty member. My job includes teaching a handful of different undergraduate level courses. I teach Foundations of Biology 1. I also teach microbiology, biochemistry, and communicating in the biological sciences. In addition to teaching, I also do service to the department and to the university, and that can vary from year to year, but encompasses all sorts of different work that helps keep our department running, and allows us to do things like create new programs for undergraduates, to make plans for the undergraduate teaching assistant program, hiring new faculty, things of that nature.
Do you have a favorite course to teach?
Oh, that's a good question. I love teaching Foundations of Biology 1. It's probably the hardest class for me to teach just because it's really huge. As you know, there are 300 students enrolled in each section. So a lot of students, but it's primarily first year students. And I think it's a really nice opportunity for me to be able to interact with students as they're transitioning into college. And it's a really early experience for a lot of students at Pitt. And so I feel like it's a place to help students make that adjustment. It's also early in your career, and so it's fun to get students excited about biology and possibly help students get into a major within biology because it's something maybe they didn't know they were interested in, then became interested in. And so it's sort of a unique time in an undergraduate student's career where I have the ability to make an impact on their trajectory, and hopefully a positive one.
It's difficult but rewarding because
Yes, exactly. It's a tough one, but it can be the most fun. The content coverage is really wide, and so there's a lot of different content areas that I get to cover, and I can cover a lot of different fun examples, and I think it lends for an enjoyable experience in creating the curriculum and what I hope students will get out of that course.
what would you say like the most challenging part of teaching that course or really any courses?
I think for foundations, the part that's most difficult is that there is a huge number of students and everybody is coming in with a very different background. And so I have some students that took AP Bio and they've already learned a lot of this material before, and they're eager to learn new material. And, there's a push for me to make sure that I'm providing new and interesting examples for those students so that they're excited by the content and don't feel like they're just retaking AP Bio from high school. So creating ways to challenge those students. While at the same time, I have lots of students that are coming in from high school who maybe didn't take AP biology. A lot of them maybe took one biology class as a first year in high school. And so it's been 4 years since they ever thought about this content area. And so for those students, I want to make sure that my course is accessible and I'm providing the appropriate materials so that every student, regardless of what they're coming in with, has what they need to be successful, and that those students are learning the fundamentals that are going to help them in their upper level classes, both in terms of content, but also skills, right? Learning how to study and learning how to think like a scientist is a big part of the class. And so that challenge of creating a curriculum that caters to students that are seeing this material for the first time ever, or for, the first time in a long time, while also keeping my students engaged that maybe just took this class last year as a senior in high school. And so balancing that can be really challenging. And then I think the other part that can be really difficult is with so many students, I have a harder time getting to know my students personally. And I try really hard to engage with as many students as I possibly can to try to build those relationships and learn students' names and understand where they're coming from. But it can be really challenging. And so trying to make the class feel smaller and make every student in the class know that I do in fact care about them, even if you don't talk to me for a couple of weeks because you haven't had an opportunity for us to engage one-on-one. It doesn't mean that I'm not checking up on you and making sure you're coming to class and checking to see how you're doing. So that's the other challenge is, I'd love to have a small class where I can interact one-on-one with every single student that I have, right? And build those relationships. And that can be tough with a big class.
Would you say like COVID-19, I know, big topic, but it has really like impacted, especially people coming from high school that may have like lost part of their like biology education or even like potentially chemistry, like the first unit of Bio 101 was biochemistry?
Yeah, I do think that there has been an impact. I don't have any real data to support that. But I do think that online learning during high school probably had an impact for many students where what they had learned maybe was a little bit different. I think it might be less content coverage and more just transitioning back from that sort of unknown online learning environment to traditional learning again. So things like knowing how to take notes in a live lecture, knowing how to create a plan for when you're going to study and how you're going to study, the critical thinking skills that you need to be able to do well in a science course. I think some of those skills we may need a little bit more practice with. And then test taking, right? I think during the pandemic, a lot of students were taking online, often open note exams and assessments, or it was more homework style written assessments. And so an exam in a classroom on paper can be really intimidating. And so understanding how to build the strategies that you need to be successful on that type of assessment can be really challenging. And then the anxiety of it, right? It's something that if you're not used to doing, it can feel really challenging and scary. And so I think there's a lot that the pandemic impacted in terms of how students are experiencing a class of 300 students. But yeah, I think in terms of content loss, I think it's highly variable depending on what your personal experience was in high school. I talked to some students who feel like it really wasn't that disrupted, right? That they were still taking classes on Zoom and they had just as much homework and they were studying just like they did before. And then I talked to students who say, I'd learned nothing that year. I did absolutely nothing, right? And so it's highly variable, which then goes back to what I was talking about before about this huge difference in terms of where students are coming from when they step in my classroom and me figuring out how do I help the students that maybe felt like they didn't learn anything during the pandemic and they need that extra background while at the same time engaging students that did have a more normal experience. I have a lot of students that will struggle at the beginning of the semester transitioning from high school to college. My first couple assessments, whether they're quizzes or exams, oftentimes students that are not used to not doing well will maybe get a low grade, and it's the lowest grade they've ever gotten. And I hear frustration from that group of students because it can be really hard to fail something for the first time or to not do as well as you thought you were going to for the first time. But so many of my students then take that as an opportunity to learn how to study and learn how to get better and figure out better strategies for learning, and then make changes and see improvements on subsequent assessments. And so there are a lot of students that I get to see sort of make that transition from, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know how to study, and I thought I knew everything, but then I got to this exam and actually I didn't, and I didn't realize that I didn't know, to taking these steps towards true learning, making an improvement, and then seeing that reflected in their scores and being able to end the semester and look back and say, like, I struggled, right? I faced some serious adversity. This was really challenging for me, but I persevered through that. I made some changes and I was able to succeed despite that. I think is probably the most rewarding part of my job, is to be a part of that process, because I think it's really, really important, again, especially for first year students coming in from high school, who so many of whom have to learn how to manage your time and how to study and all of these skills that you might not have built in high school. So that is a big part of my job that I love. I think that also sort of extends longer term because I do teach in both microbiology and biochemistry, and I have a lot of students come back and serve as TAs for all of my courses. And so I often will have a student that I meet as a first year who maybe struggles a little bit in foundations, but then I have them come back later, either as a TA or in biochemistry or in microbio, and see the progressions that they've made over 3 or 4 years, and figuring out who they are personally, what they want to do professionally, and just watching that growth can be really rewarding, and just a fun experience. I have a couple of TAs who actually failed my class the first time they took it, right? That took the class, totally bombed it, came back, retook it, and ended with an A, like made huge changes, really persevered through major challenge, and then came back and they're TAing, and I can see them teaching another student something that they really struggled with. And just seeing that progression, that growth is awesome. Even though when they failed the first time, that student probably hated my guts and was really upset about it. I don't enjoy that part of it, but to see that growth and that progression and what they learn from that and how they become better at their job and what they're going to go on and do, I think is really cool.
Have you always been interested in teaching, or did you ever consider a different career in or outside of like the STEM field?
I have not always been interested in teaching. At least I didn't know it. I was always interested in biology. I loved learning biology throughout school. When I went to college, I was a biology major, and I assumed that the only thing that you could do with a biology major is go to medical school. So I was pre-med for a couple of years in college. And I started on the path of preparing for medical school and figuring out what I needed to do to get into medical school. I spent a summer working as a nurse's aide in an assisted living community, and I hated it. I enjoyed interacting with the people that lived there, but anytime anything medically happened, I realized that I have a very weak stomach and I'm incredibly sensitive, and it didn't feel like it was who I was and the kind of work that I enjoyed. And so I had to pivot at that point, and definitely felt a bit like, okay, I love biology, but I don't love medicine. So I spent some time, I think this was during my junior year of college, really trying to figure out like, okay, if I don't go to medical school, what is the other option? And I thought about other things that are medically relevant or sort of related, physical therapy or nutrition or even physician assistant, things that are similar, but not medical school. And I kept coming back to this same, I don't want to work with patients, right? That's not what I see myself doing. And so it wasn't until I had a professor who I talked to about this, and I had taken his class and had written a term paper, and he was like, you're a really good writer, and there's a lot of writing involved in research. Have you ever thought about doing research? And I had no idea what that meant, right? I didn't understand what doing research involved, and I couldn't imagine myself just like coming up with some question and making my own hypotheses and designing experiments. I didn't think that was something I could do. But I'm glad that I tried, right? That I had somebody that pushed me, and he had helped me apply for a summer research program that I ended up getting into. It was a 10-week, really intensive undergraduate research experience. And I worked in a lab where we were looking for bacteriophages in soil samples and trying to characterize them. So viruses that infect bacteria. And I learned a lot about just like setting up a lab. I learned about what research entails, how to talk about and present research, how to write about research. And I got really interested in the project that we were doing because it was the first time where it was like, I'm answering a question that we don't actually know the answer to, right? It's not something you can go and look up because no one's ever done it before. And so there was that discovery aspect of doing research that I had never experienced before, and I really enjoyed. And it was also a lot more collaborative than I was expecting. So I had sort of pictured, okay, if I do research, I'm going to be in a lab all by myself. But it was actually a really fun community of people that enjoyed exchanging ideas and talking about their science and discussing next steps. And so it was much more social than I thought it would be. So yeah, that's what pushed me into research. And it was because of that I decided to pursue a PhD program. But again, I will say I didn't really know what I was getting into at the time because it all sort of fell into place. I don't have family members that have pursued PhDs, and so I didn't have anybody that knew what that process looked like. I felt like I was kind of on my own to figure that out. But yeah, in the end, I ended up going to graduate school for molecular cell and developmental biology. And it was in grad school when I started learning about teaching and science education. The program that I was in had a teaching minor. And so I took some classes on pedagogy and best practices in teaching. I served as a graduate TA for a number of different semesters in a variety of different courses. And I started to really fall in love with teaching and realize how much I enjoyed it. And that's what really pushed me into teaching as a career instead of just research as a career. And that love has then, I think, just continued since I started my job. The more experience I have and the more interactions I have with students, the more I realize what challenges there are, and the more excited I get about figuring out how to address those challenges using research, right? And my background in research.
You kind of like took a risk, but it worked out obviously in the end because you're happy with what you do.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
But I do think a lot of people's career trajectory mirrors that in a way, in that I don't meet a ton of people today who say, I'm doing exactly the thing that I thought I was going to do when I was 19.
Kind of on the same lines. Many pre-L students struggle with like taking science classes at Pitt and often feel like they should drop out of a science field. Do you have any advice for students? Like, obviously you stopped doing pre-med for different reasons, but there's other science careers as well.
Well, I think it's important to just explore all your options. I think it's really easy to fall into this trap that you think that medical school is the only option, and it's not, right? There are so many different career paths and so many different things that you can do. And so college is the best time to start exploring those interests and those passions, and to talk to as many people as you can, learn about different career paths and ways in which people get to where they end up, and to really think about what it is that you enjoy. I would never discourage someone from being pre-med and taking hard science classes. If you want to be a doctor and you want to go to medical school, you absolutely can, right? I think everybody here at Pitt absolutely could do that if they wanted to. It takes a lot of dedication, it takes a lot of passion. It also takes a lot of struggle. And that's something I think a lot of students have a hard time with, is the minute it gets hard and it feels like I'm not going to pass this class, or I really have no idea what my professor is talking about, it can be really easy to take that as evidence that I don't belong here. I'm not supposed to do this. This isn't for me. And I think that type of mindset can be really detrimental, right? Just because you face adversity, just because you face challenge, doesn't mean you don't belong, or doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue on that path. It just means that you might need some help. You might need to seek out some resources. You might need to make some changes in the way that you're approaching a class or approaching the material. But there are people at Pitt that are here to help you do that, and seeking out those resources is important. So I really think it's super dependent on the student, right? Sometimes I talk to students who are pre-med, but then I ask them, like, why do you want to go to medical school? What's the driving factor? And oftentimes the answer is, well, I've just always kind of wanted to be a doctor. It's like, okay, but why? Why do you want to be a doctor? What do you see yourself doing on a day-to-day basis? How do you see this being a part of your life? What are your hopes and your dreams, and what do you want this to look like when you grow up and you have a career and you're balancing your career with the rest of your life? And it can depend on the student. For some people, it's very obvious that this has been integrated into their vision of their life forever. And there are other students where it's not. And it just is, this is just what I thought that my career was going to look like. And it's okay if it doesn't. And now's the opportunity to go and look at other options. And choosing to not go to medical school is not a failure. Medical school is hard. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of money. And if it's not something that you're super passionate about, there are other great options.
I now know that you do teaching, like education research. What motivated you to like make that switch from doing like microbiology research to more education-based research?
I think partway through graduate school, when I was focusing a lot on teaching and had become really interested in teaching, I started learning about this idea of education research, that the decisions that we make in the classroom are based on evidence. that a given strategy is going to work and is going to be effective. And it was in grad school that I started reading the literature surrounding biology education and the ways in which we learn, the ways that we can instruct so that we're most effective, strategies that help with assessment and best assessing student understanding. And then I got very interested in classroom climate and the way in which you build your classroom to promote learning from all students, right? How do you create a space where everybody in the room feels comfortable sharing their ideas and feels like they can take a risk and it's okay if they're wrong, right? That sort of climate aspect of teaching was also important to me. And so I think the transition happened naturally in that my focus shifted, right? I was really interested in the biology and I still am very interested in the biology. But I went from focusing on the biology to focusing on the students learning the biology. And so my research informs what I do in the classroom. And so my research focuses more on how students learn and what are strategies that we as instructors can use to create a space to promote learning. So that transition really happened because my focus shifted. And when I began in my current role, my job was to teach, right? And that was where my focus lies.
I read some of your papers like on like reducing isolation in the classroom. Like what kind of like started the idea of like, oh, some people are like not doing as well as others, like based on like a couple of factors like race and like if their parents went to college?
There are lots of studies that show things like stereotype threat and how psychological factors like stereotype threat can impact a student's sense of belonging. And as a result of that, impact their outcomes in the classroom, right? Grades. And so I got interested in this when I started teaching Foundations of Biology 1 because I was looking at grade distributions and I was looking at who is successful in this class. And I sort of started noticing some demographic-based achievement gaps that can't be explained by, anything except what's happening in my classroom, right? Our admission standards at Pitt are really high. So everybody's coming in a way that they're qualified to be at Pitt. They are going to be successful here, right? They have every tool that they need to be successful, regardless of their race or gender. And then we see achievement gaps developing in a classroom and, it's because of something happening in the classroom, right? And so my goal with that was to try to understand what was happening in the classroom, right? Why were achievement gaps developing? And one of the things I learned from reading a lot about the psychology of stereotype threat and belonging is that if you are in a space where you feel like you don't belong, that can impact your ability to bounce back from, say, a poor test grade, or may hinder your ability to ask for help when you need it, right? If you're in a space where you are among a minoritized group, and specifically a stereotyped minoritized group, and you feel like you don't belong in that space, and then say you don't do well on an exam, it's really easy to take that, as I said, as evidence of, oh, actually, I thought I didn't belong, and this is more evidence that I don't belong. And instead of then reacting to that by asking for help or changing the way that you study, can be really easy to then just say, okay, well, I lived up to that stereotype, and so that's it for me, right? And so I think the way in which we talk about struggle in the classroom is really important for everybody, but particularly for students that are facing stereotype threat. This idea that it's okay to struggle, it's normal to struggle, struggling is part of the process, right? That's how we learn. And you should be struggling, right? That's part of the learning process. And that if you are struggling and if you are having, facing adversity, that it's not because of your gender or because of your race. It's because that's part of the process, right? And it doesn't mean you don't belong here. It means you do belong here. It means that we need to figure out how to help you learn or what ways in which you learn best. But really my goal is to mitigate that self-fulfilling prophecy of I don't belong here, and then here this is evidence of that, and so I'm going to give up, right? And I think that can have the most impact on students who may be sitting in a classroom where they look around and say, nobody here looks like me, and so I don't belong here.
What do you do to like, I guess, like implement that change into the classroom so that more people feel like that they belong?
There are some activities that I've run that specifically address struggle and are designed to demonstrate that struggle is normal and also surmountable. So, specifically talking about this idea early in the semester. So, in a recitation in the first week, for example, spending time with students having this discussion on, okay, what challenges have you faced? Everybody should be able to write about a challenge that they faced because we all face challenges, right? And how have those challenges begun to feel different or get better with time, right? This idea that we face adversity, but then we can resolve that, right? There are ways in which that we can overcome adversity. Um, and so working in those types of activities early in the semester can be really helpful, I think, for a lot of students. Um, Doing things like the exam wrappers that I do, where after an exam, I specifically talk about this idea of growth mindset and struggling being normal and normalizing this idea that if you didn't get the grade that you wanted, that doesn't mean that you're not a good person or that you don't belong here, right? That just means that we have to figure out how to study or how to change habits to get you to where you want to be, because you absolutely can get there, right? There's that growth. How do we grow from this rather than taking this as evidence that you don't belong? So a lot of it is just bringing it up and talking about it. And then I think little things that instructors can do is, really encouraging students to ask questions and come to office hours, right? Normalizing office hours as not a time that you go because you need help, but a time that everybody should take advantage of because everybody should be asking questions, right? And again, normalizing this resource for all students to take advantage of. And then I think in general, creating community in the classroom so that you don't feel alone. So in recitation, for example, creating groups and having you come up with a team name and, the weekly icebreakers, right? So these things that I try to do to make sure everyone in the classroom has peers that they can go to if they need help. I assign an undergrad TA to every team so that there's, maybe I don't know exactly which days you haven't been in class, but your TA is going to know, right? So somebody on the instructional team knows who you are, knows you by name, and knows if you're there or not, if you need help, and they're there to sort of guide you through the weekly activities. So I think there's a lot that instructors can do to try to create that community and to, send the message as much as possible that it's okay to struggle and that we're here to help, and it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to use the resources that are provided for you to get help. And that's, again, a normal part of the learning process.
I think it's important to like emphasize that everyone struggles because it's like unrealistic to expect yourself not to at some point.
Yep.
Would that like go back into like the rewarding part? Is like, I know you talked about earlier, like obviously people like rebounding their grade and stuff, but like it's kind of like a small example. But like, would you say that like kind of teaching people that like an important life lesson like about struggling is a part of the rewarding experience?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought a bit about it as teaching people a life lesson, but the way that now that you say that, yeah, I think it is an important thing to learn. It's funny because the first time I started doing this and I started talking about it openly in class, where I would talk about, struggle and how everybody faces struggle, I think initially I thought, okay, everybody knows this. Like, this isn't new. It just sounds like I'm preaching, or, but then in talking to students afterwards, I have had students say like, it really helps to know that you've struggled before, right? It sort of changes the dynamic between us in talking about struggle, because I'm willing to admit that, yeah, I've faced challenges. I've failed a test before. Like, it's happened to me. It can happen to you, and that's okay. So yeah, I guess hearing that from students after I've talked about it in class is rewarding, and I guess means that what I'm trying to do is working for at least some students.
Within your own challenges, like did you ever have like doubt about what you were doing when you were in college?
Constantly. Absolutely. I mean, I told you the story about the pre-med thing. So that was obviously a big part of college, was figuring out what I do if I don't go to medical school. And then In grad school, transitioning from college to grad school was challenging. My class of PhD students had 9 of us, and I felt like every other person that was there remembered more from college, took more classes, had more research experience. I had done research for a year in undergrad. I didn't have a ton, and I had peers that had done it for 4 years and had a publication and were way ahead. And so there was definitely a little bit of imposter syndrome for me in my PhD program, at least for the first year. And then throughout my PhD, there were milestones where I always was questioning, like, am I going to ever graduate, right? Is this a program that I'm going to be able to finish? Am I capable of doing this? Am I ever going to publish my own paper? Am I ever going to, you know, be able to write a dissertation and defend it and answer all the questions about it? All of those steps along the way were challenging. And at every step, I think I questioned, do I belong here? And then I still do in my job all the time, right? I've been in a number of situations where I think, oh, I'm an imposter, right? That feeling of imposter syndrome, where you feel like I've just convinced everybody that I know what I'm doing, but actually I have no idea what I'm doing. That sticks, I think, for a lot of people for a long time. But there are strategies to, convince myself that, yeah, I can do this. I've got this. Yeah.
Would you say you like suffered from like the small pond effect of like, even though you may be like the best like overall like like on a national scale, but because you're only comparing yourself to like such a small group, like in the PhD setting it was 8 other people, like would you say that you kind of like suffered from that because it almost felt like you were behind, even if like compared to everyone in the population you weren't?
That's a really good point. Again, I hadn't really ever thought of it that way, but yes, absolutely. I mean, there were 9 of us that had made it through the application process and the interview process and had been accepted. And so I was, and I think back to college, I had a lot of friends in college that were not in biology, right? And so I wasn't comparing myself on a day-to-day basis with other scientists, right? And so now all of a sudden it was 9 people who were all interested in the same thing as I was, who all had the same qualifications to get accepted. But in my mind, they had better qualifications, right? There's always that comparison. So yeah, absolutely. There's that feeling of competitiveness with the people around you. And in the end, I became very good friends with all of my classmates, and we ended up helping each other and working together on a lot of things and studying for exams together in that first year. And so it turned out to be a really rewarding experience. And it wasn't that competitive experience that I thought it was going to be in that first year. And that I think is an important thing to know, that it's always better to help each other than to compete with each other. But I think in college and, among pre-med students in medical school, there's always this feeling of competition, and it can be hard to take yourself out of that, because that just makes it harder.
Since you said you had friends like that weren't in biology or science, like would you say there was like any like almost like not career envy, but you're going to graduate school, like you have another like potentially like 7 years ahead of you there, where they're like starting their jobs and stuff, like how did you handle that? Because like obviously a lot of people in the science majors plan to go get a good graduate school, so like there's a lot more time that they're spending than other majors.
That's an interesting question. I have to say that I graduated college in 2009, which was the peak of the recession. So there were no jobs,
Oh.
or there were few jobs. And so I think going to graduate school was almost a relief compared to a lot of my friends that were struggling to find jobs. That being said, I have heard from other people that go into grad school that, okay, I'm extending the amount of time that I'm in school, and I wish I was working or that I had a job. I never felt like that. I loved school. I liked being in school, and the thought of just transitioning from one school into another school was actually easy for me to see myself doing. Whereas at, 22 years old, the idea of starting a job and not being in school anymore was scary because that would have been very new for me. So I don't think I ever felt like that. The the other kind of nice thing about PhD programs in the sciences is that they pay you a stipend and you don't pay tuition. So even though you are in school, it feels more like a transition between school and a job. So especially when you get later in the program. So the first year you're taking some classes, you're doing research, but then as you progress through the program, you're doing more research and taking fewer classes. And so you're basically working a job in a lab and you're getting paid to do it. And you're also getting a degree in the end. And so it was almost a really nice transition for me between school and a work life, right? And I don't know, I think it worked out great. I never really compared myself to friends that were working. I guess the only part would be on, weekends when I had to study and they didn't. But I can't even remember ever feeling bad about that. I liked what I was doing.
How would you say your graduate school journey was like overall? Like, because many people do it, like it kind of seems daunting. It's a lot of years in theory. So
It is a lot of years, but I have to say, now looking back on it, it doesn't feel like it was a lot of years. So it took me 5 years to finish my PhD. And it feels like a snapshot in my life right now. I really loved grad school. I had a great experience. It was definitely challenging and there were aspects of it that were hard. But I really liked it. I had some really great friends that I made in my program with grad students in other labs, but also within the lab that I worked in. I had a really excellent mentor who helped me learn how to be a scientist and was incredibly supportive of everything that I did, including all of the teaching that I wanted to do, and sort of really gave me the time that I needed to be able to do that without a ton of pressure to publish my work immediately so that I could keep, getting experiments done and publishing. He was very supportive of the things that I wanted to be spending my time doing, which I thought was great. I also, met a lot of really awesome mentors for teaching. So the teaching minor program that I did forced me to build connections with faculty in my department that were engaged in teaching and science education. And it was because of those connections that I ended up getting involved in science education research after I graduated. And so all of that networking led to professional relationships that I still have today. And those mentorship relationships are incredibly important to me and taught me the importance of mentoring, which I hadn't really thought about prior to grad school. And is something now that I think about with my own students okay, I've had mentors that have really helped me make big decisions in my life and who I've learned a lot from, and giving that back now to students and helping to mentor students through their own experience in college and grad school and that transition. So yeah, overall, I think I had a great experience. I learned a ton. I think the beauty of a PhD is that you become an expert on a very specific topic, but in the process, you learn how to learn and how to question things. So I always say, my PhD training is less about this specific topic of my dissertation and more about my ability to learn something new on my own, right? And that has helped me a lot in teaching a variety of different courses, right? Teaching both microbiology and biochemistry. Those are two completely different fields, neither of which are actually what I studied in graduate school. And so being able to then teach myself and find the appropriate literature to support what I'm teaching and to provide examples for what I'm teaching, all of that knowledge I've gained from the skills of a PhD, not the PhD itself, right?
I know you got your PhD at Pitt. Did you expect to stay at Pitt for teaching, or did that just happen?
Yeah, no, I didn't expect to. And I think it worked out. I'm really glad I'm still here. But yeah, when I finished in July and I was looking at, what am I going to do next, right? What kinds of positions am I going to look at? Where do I want to apply? And so I was open to various ideas, but I didn't have anything lined up yet when I graduated. And the biological sciences department at Pitt had an opening for a visiting lecturer to teach foundations of biology and some other courses. So I was given a 1-year position. And during that year, I taught courses on my own at Pitt, and then applied to positions all over the country. I went and interviewed at lots of different places. And one of the places that I formally applied to and interviewed at was Pitt. So I also applied basically for the same job, but more permanent. And Pitt ended up being the best fit that year. And I always sort of thought like, well, I could always apply again, right? And if I want to go elsewhere, I always have that opportunity. But Pitt has sort of given me a lot of different opportunities to teach the classes I want to teach, but then also to get involved in this education research. And I've made really great connections with people at Pitt that do that research that I can be involved in addition to my teaching. So I think I've stayed because of all of those connections that I've built.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome.
With the interview.